Mr. Harrison, I need to be honest with you. We've exhausted every treatment option. Your daughter has maybe 3 months. I'm so sorry. Dr. Mitchell's words hung in the air like a death sentence. James Harrison sat frozen in the leather chair of the oncologist's office, his hands gripping the armrests until his knuckles turned white. Behind him, through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the hospital's executive wing, the city stretched out below. From up here, everything looked so small, so manageable, but nothing about this moment felt manageable. 3 months. His daughter Sophie was 8 years old. 8. She should be worrying about spelling tests and playground arguments, not whether she'd live to see her 9th birthday. There has to be something, James said, his voice hollow. Another trial, a specialist in Europe, anything. Dr. Mitchell shook his head slowly. We've tried everything, Mr. Harrison. The leukemia is aggressive, stage 4. Her body isn't responding to chemotherapy anymore. We've consulted with teams in Switzerland, Germany, Japan. Everyone agrees. James stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the polished floor. So you're telling me to just take her home and watch her die? I'm telling you to take her home and make the time she has left meaningful, comfortable, full of love. Dr. Mitchell's voice was gentle but firm. Sometimes that's all we can do. The drive home felt endless. James barely remembered getting in the car, starting the engine, pulling out of the parking garage. The city passed by in a blur of brake lights and shadows. His hands moved mechanically on the steering wheel, but his mind was somewhere else, trapped in a loop of denial and rage. Sophie sat in the back seat, her small frame lost in the oversized car seat they'd had to keep because she'd lost so much weight. Her head was wrapped in a soft pink scarf covering the baldness from months of failed treatments. She stared out the window, not asking questions anymore. She'd stopped asking questions weeks ago. When they arrived at the estate, the iron gates swung open automatically. The mansion rose before them, all stone and glass and empty rooms. 12 bedrooms, 9 bathrooms, a home theater, an indoor pool. What did any of it matter? James's mother, Patricia, met them at the door. She'd been staying with them since Sophie's diagnosis 6 months ago, trying to fill the impossible gap left by James's late wife. Sophie's mother had died in a car accident 2 years earlier. Now James was facing the possibility of losing his daughter too. "How did it go?" Patricia asked quietly, though she already knew from James's face. 3 months, he said flatly, walking past her into the house. Sophie shuffled inside, moving slowly. Patricia helped her out of her coat and guided her toward the living room, where medical equipment now dominated the space. An IV pole stood in the corner. Oxygen tanks lined the wall. The couch where Sophie used to jump and play was now covered with medical supply boxes. The house had become a hospital, and James hated every inch of it. That night, James locked himself in his study. The room was dark except for the glow of his laptop screen. He researched obsessively, typing search after search into medical databases, experimental treatments, holistic approaches, miracle cures, anything. But every article led to the same conclusion: stage 4 pediatric leukemia with treatment resistance. Survival rate, less than 5%. He slammed the laptop shut and buried his face in his hands. For the first time since his wife's funeral, James Harrison allowed himself to break. The sobs came hard and silent, his whole body shaking. He'd built a billion-dollar tech empire from nothing. He'd survived hostile takeovers, economic crashes, public scandals. But he couldn't save his little girl. The next morning, Patricia made an announcement at breakfast. "I've hired someone to help." James barely looked up from his coffee. "We already have nurses." "Not a nurse, someone to help around the house, with Sophie, with everything." Patricia handed him a folder. "Her name is Maria Santos. She starts today." James flipped through the papers without interest. Background check, references, A photo of a woman in her mid-30s with dark hair pulled back, warm brown eyes, and a quiet smile. He didn't care. What difference did another stranger make? "Fine," he said, closing the folder. "Whatever you think is best." Maria arrived at 10 in the morning. James watched from his study window as an old sedan pulled up the circular driveway. A woman stepped out, wearing simple jeans and a blue sweater, carrying a small bag. She looked up at the mansion with an expression James couldn't quite read. Not intimidation, something else. Recognition, maybe, like she'd seen houses like this before and knew what they held inside. Patricia greeted her at the door. James listened to their muffled voices from upstairs but didn't go down. He had calls to make, emails to send, business to pretend still mattered. An hour later, Patricia knocked on his study door. "Maria would like to meet you." James sighed and followed his mother downstairs. In the kitchen, Maria stood by the counter, hands folded in front of her. Up close, she looked tired. Not old, but worn, like someone who'd carried heavy things for a long time. "Mr. Harrison," she said, extending her hand. Her grip was firm and warm. "Thank you for having me in your home." "My mother hired you," James said bluntly. "I assume she explained the situation. My daughter is very sick. She needs quiet, routine, no disruptions." "I understand." "There are cameras throughout the house," James continued, his voice cold and clinical. "Security system, motion sensors. We've had issues before." Maria nodded without flinching. "I understand that too." James studied her face, looking for signs of judgment or pity. He found neither. "Good. Patricia will show you where everything is. You'll have access to most of the house, except my private office and the security room. Questions?" "Just one," Maria said softly. "May I meet Sophie?" James hesitated. Something about the way she asked, not "may I see her" or "may I be introduced," but "may I meet her?" Like Sophie was a person to know, not a patient to manage. "She's resting," he said finally. "You can meet her later." Maria nodded. "Of course." That night, after Patricia had gone to bed and Sophie was asleep, James did what he did every night. He opened his laptop, logged into the security system, and began reviewing the day's footage. He'd installed the cameras 2 years ago after a nanny had stolen jewelry and sold stories about Sophie's mother to tabloids. Then there was the physical therapist who'd leaked medical records, the private chef who'd tried to blackmail him, the housekeeper who'd invited reporters onto the property. Trust was a luxury James Harrison could no longer afford. He clicked through camera feeds methodically. Kitchen, living room, hallways. The cameras captured everything in silent, time-stamped clips. At 14:32, Maria had entered Sophie's room, carrying a tray of soup. Sophie had refused to eat. Maria had set the tray down and sat on the edge of the bed. No words exchanged. Just sitting there. 19 minutes, according to the timestamp. Just sitting. At 16:47, Maria was in the hallway outside Sophie's room. She stood against the wall, head bowed, eyes closed. James zoomed in. Her lips were moving. Praying? Maybe. After a long moment, she'd straightened and walked away. At 19:23, after dinner, Maria had cleaned the kitchen. Nothing unusual. Efficient movements, no phone, no snooping, just work. James closed the laptop. Nothing suspicious, nothing concerning, just a woman doing her job. But something about those 19 minutes sitting on Sophie's bed bothered him. Not because it was wrong, because it was unexpected. Nobody just sat anymore. Everyone was always doing, fixing, managing, trying. But Maria had just sat, present, still. James didn't know what to make of that. So he filed it away and went to bed. Another day survived, another night of restless sleep ahead. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The next morning started like all the others. Medical routine, temperature check, medication schedule. Sophie barely spoke during breakfast, pushing scrambled eggs around her plate without eating. "Just 3 bites, sweetheart," Patricia coaxed gently. Sophie shook her head. "I'm not hungry." "The doctor said you need to eat." "The doctor said I'm dying," Sophie said flatly. "So what does it matter?" The words hit like a slap. Patricia's face crumpled. James, standing in the doorway with his coffee, felt his chest tighten. His 8-year-old daughter knew. Of course she knew. They'd never explicitly told her, but children aren't stupid. They hear the whispered conversations. They see the tears quickly wiped away. They feel the change in the air. Maria, who'd been washing dishes at the sink, turned slowly. She dried her hands and walked over to the table, kneeling beside Sophie's chair so they were eye level. "You're right," Maria said simply. "It does matter." Sophie looked at her, surprised. "It matters because your body is fighting, and fighting takes energy, and energy comes from food." Maria picked up the fork. "So even if you're not hungry, even if it's hard, you eat, not for the doctors, not for anyone else, for you, because you're still here. And while you're here, you fight." Sophie stared at her for a long moment. Then slowly she took the fork from Maria's hand and ate 1 bite, then another, then a third. Maria stood and returned to the sink without another word. James watched from the doorway, stunned. How had she done that? Nurses had tried. Patricia had tried. He'd tried. But this stranger had simply knelt down, told the truth, and somehow gotten through. Later that afternoon, James was on a conference call when he heard something that made him stop mid-sentence. Music. Soft and faint, coming from somewhere in the house. He muted his microphone and stepped into the hallway, listening. The sound was coming from Sophie's room. He walked quietly down the hall and stopped outside her door, which was slightly open. Through the gap, he could see Maria sitting on the floor beside Sophie's bed. Sophie was lying down, eyes half closed, breathing shallow, and Maria was singing, not a lullaby, not a children's song, something in Spanish, low and gentle, almost like a prayer. Her voice was untrained but pure, carrying a melody that felt old and familiar, even though James had never heard it before. Sophie's fingers moved slightly in time with the music. Her breathing seemed to deepen, to relax. James stood there for a full minute, just listening. He didn't recognize the language, but he understood the meaning. Comfort, presence, the promise that someone was there. When the song ended, Maria stayed quiet. Sophie whispered something James couldn't hear. "Yes, mi niña," Maria replied softly. "I'll stay as long as you need." James backed away from the door before they could see him. He returned to his study, his conference call forgotten on the screen. His hands were shaking. Who was this woman, and why did she make him feel like he'd been doing everything wrong? That night, James returned to the security footage with new urgency. He needed to understand. He needed to see what was happening when he wasn't watching. He pulled up the day's recordings and fast-forwarded through the mundane moments. Then he slowed down when Maria entered Sophie's room again around 15. She carried a small box. She set it on the bed and opened it carefully. Inside were colored pencils and a sketch pad. Sophie, who'd barely had energy to lift her head lately, sat up slightly. "I used to draw when I was sad," Maria said on the footage. "It helped." "I can't draw," Sophie said weakly. "That's okay, I can't either." Maria smiled. "But we can try together." They drew for 30 minutes. Simple things. Flowers, stars, a lopsided cat. Sophie's hands shook and her lines were uneven, but she was focused, present, almost smiling. James replayed that section 3 times, just to make sure he was seeing it correctly. His daughter, who'd been listless and withdrawn for weeks, was drawing, creating something, living, even if just for 30 minutes. The next clip made James sit up straighter in his chair. At 18:45, after dinner, Maria had gone out to the garden. She stood beneath the old oak tree in the backyard, arms wrapped around herself, and then her shoulders began to shake. She was crying. James zoomed in as much as the camera allowed. Maria's face was hidden, but her whole body trembled with silent sobs. She stayed there for nearly 10 minutes before finally wiping her face, taking a deep breath and walking back inside. By the time she re-entered the house, her expression was calm again, composed, like nothing had happened. James leaned back in his chair, staring at the frozen image on screen. This woman, this stranger, was crying alone in his garden. Why? What was she carrying? And why did she hide it so carefully? He spent the next hour searching her name online. Maria Santos. Common name, too common, but he narrowed it down with the city, her age, her previous employment. What he found made his blood run cold. A obituary from 6 years ago. Santos, Isabella Maria, age 9, beloved daughter of Maria Santos, died peacefully after a courageous battle with leukemia. Services private. James read it 3 times to make sure he understood. Maria had lost a daughter to leukemia, the same disease killing Sophie. His mind raced. Did Patricia know? Had Maria disclosed this during the interview? He pulled up the employment file Patricia had given him. Nothing. No mention of children, living or deceased. Maria had left that part out entirely. James's first instinct was anger. She'd hidden something. She should have disclosed it. This was a violation of trust. But then he looked back at the screen, at the image of Maria standing under the tree, shoulders shaking with grief. And he understood. She hadn't come here by accident. She'd come on purpose, to finish something she couldn't finish 6 years ago, to save the child she couldn't save. Sophie wasn't just a job to her. She was a second chance. James closed the laptop slowly. He didn't know how to feel. Part of him wanted to fire her immediately, to eliminate the risk of someone so emotionally invested, making poor decisions. But another part of him, the part he'd been trying to silence for months, whispered something different. Maybe that's exactly what Sophie needs, someone who loves her enough to cry in secret. He sat in the dark for a long time, wrestling with himself. Finally, he made a decision. He would watch. Closely, every camera, every interaction, every moment. If Maria was here to help, truly help, then he would let her try. But if she stepped out of line, if she gave him any reason to doubt, he would end it immediately, because he'd already lost a wife. He couldn't afford to lose his daughter, too, not to death, and not to misplaced trust. The house settled into silence around him. Somewhere upstairs, Sophie slept, her small body fighting a war it was losing. And somewhere else in the house, Maria Santos lay awake too, carrying the weight of a promise she'd made to a ghost. Neither of them knew that in the days ahead, everything would change. Because love, when it's real and desperate and unstoppable, doesn't follow rules. It just breaks through. The days began to blur together, but James noticed everything. Every morning he reviewed the security footage from the night before. Every evening he watched the live feeds while pretending to work. He told himself it was caution, vigilance, protection. But deep down, he knew the truth. He was searching for something. He just didn't know what yet. Maria moved through the house like a quiet current, never demanding attention but somehow changing everything she touched. She didn't follow the strict protocols the nurses had established. She didn't keep the clinical distance the previous caregivers had maintained. Instead, she did something far more dangerous. She treated Sophie like a living child, not a dying patient. On the 3rd day, James watched through the cameras as Maria sat on the floor of Sophie's room, legs crossed, a children's book open in her lap. But she wasn't reading from it. She was telling stories from memory, her hands moving expressively, her voice rising and falling with the rhythm of the tale. Sophie, propped up on pillows, watched her with something James hadn't seen in months. Interest. Actual interest. Her eyes followed Maria's gestures, her lips curved slightly at the funny parts. She was present in a way she hadn't been since before the diagnosis. "Why do you know so many stories?" Sophie asked, her voice thin but curious. Maria's hands stilled for just a moment. "I used to tell them to someone very special to me." "Who?" "Someone who loved stories as much as you do." Sophie didn't push further, and Maria continued with another tale. But James, watching from his study, felt something twist in his chest. That someone was Isabella, the daughter Maria had lost. The following day brought a change James hadn't expected. Dr. Patel, Sophie's oncologist, made a house call for routine blood work. James stood in the hallway while the nurse drew samples, Sophie wincing but not crying. She'd gotten so used to needles. When Dr. Patel emerged from the room, his expression was professionally neutral, but something in his eyes caught James's attention. "Her color looks better," the doctor said carefully. "Is she eating more?" "A little," James admitted. "The new housekeeper has been helpful. Keep doing whatever you're doing. I'll call with the blood results tomorrow." Dr. Patel packed his bag slowly. "Mr. Harrison, I want to be clear. I'm not promising anything, but sometimes patients surprise us." After he left, James found Maria in the kitchen preparing lunch. She was cutting fruit into small, manageable pieces, arranging them on a plate in the shape of a flower. "Dr. Patel said she looks better," James said from the doorway. Maria glanced up. "She's trying harder." "Because of you." Maria shook her head. "Because of herself. I just remind her why it matters." "And why does it matter?" James asked, surprised by the edge in his own voice. "If she's dying anyway, why make her fight?" Maria set down the knife and turned to face him fully. Her eyes, warm but firm, held his gaze without flinching. "Because hope isn't about the destination, Mr. Harrison. It's about the journey, and Sophie deserves to walk that journey with dignity, not despair." James wanted to argue, to tell her that false hope was crueler than honest surrender, but the words wouldn't come, because somewhere deep inside, he knew she was right. That evening something happened that James would replay in his mind 1,000 times. He was in his study reviewing contracts when his phone buzzed with a motion alert from the security system. Camera 7, Sophie's bathroom. He frowned. Motion alerts in that room usually meant Sophie was sick, vomiting from the medication. He pulled up the live feed, ready to call for Patricia or the night nurse, but what he saw on the screen made him freeze. Maria stood in front of Sophie's bathroom mirror, alone. In her hand was a pair of electric clippers. The bathroom door was closed. She thought she was alone. James watched, confused, as Maria lifted the clippers to her head. And then she turned them on. The buzzing sound was audible even through the computer speakers. Maria closed her eyes and began shaving her head. Long, dark hair fell in thick chunks to the floor. She worked methodically, section by section, until her scalp was completely bare. James sat paralyzed, his mind struggling to understand what he was seeing. When Maria finished, she stared at her reflection for a long moment, running her hand over her smooth head. Her eyes were wet, but she didn't cry. She just stood there, transformed. Then she cleaned up the hair, threw it away, and stepped out of the bathroom. James switched to the hallway camera, watching as Maria walked directly to Sophie's room. His heart pounded. What was she doing? Through Sophie's bedroom camera, he watched Maria enter quietly. Sophie was awake, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling with that empty expression James had come to dread. "Sophie," Maria said softly. Sophie turned her head, and then her eyes went wide. She sat up so fast that James flinched. "Your hair," Sophie whispered. "You cut your hair." Maria smiled and sat on the edge of the bed. "I did." "But why?" Sophie's hand reached out tentatively, touching Maria's smooth head. "You had such pretty hair." "Because you don't have yours," Maria said simply. "And I thought maybe it would be easier if you weren't alone, if someone walked this part of the journey with you." Sophie's face crumpled, not with sadness, but with something else. Something that looked like relief, like recognition, like she'd been waiting for someone to finally understand. "You didn't have to do that," Sophie said, her voice breaking. "I know, but I wanted to." Maria took Sophie's hands gently. "You are not alone in this, mi niña. You are not walking through darkness by yourself. I'm right here beside you. Do you understand?" Sophie nodded, tears streaming down her face. And then she did something she hadn't done in weeks. She reached out and hugged Maria tightly, burying her face in Maria's shoulder. Maria held her, one hand on the back of Sophie's head, the other wrapped around her small frame. She whispered something in Spanish that James couldn't hear through the speakers. James's phone slipped from his hands. It hit the desk with a dull thud. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what he'd just witnessed. This woman, this stranger, had shaved her own head, not for money, not for recognition, not because anyone asked. She'd done it in secret, alone, as an act of pure solidarity, to make an 8-year-old girl feel less alone in her suffering. James's vision blurred, his hands shook. Something inside his chest cracked wide open, not pain, not grief, something else entirely, something that felt like light breaking through stone. He pushed back from his desk and stumbled to the window, gripping the frame. Outside, the estate's grounds stretched into darkness, the perfectly manicured lawn, the expensive fountain, the security lights illuminating a property worth $30 million. And none of it, not one single piece of it, could do what Maria had just done. James sank to his knees on the carpet of his study. The sobs came hard and sudden, shaking his entire body. He pressed his fist against his mouth, trying to stay quiet. But it was useless. Everything he'd been holding back for months poured out. The grief, the rage, the helplessness, the crushing weight of watching his daughter die while being powerless to stop it. For the first time since his wife's funeral, James Harrison broke completely. Downstairs, Maria tucked Sophie back into bed, both of them bawled, both of them smiling through tears. Sophie ran her hand over Maria's head one more time. "We match now," Sophie whispered. "Yes, we do," Maria said. "And we're beautiful." Sophie laughed, actually laughed. The sound echoed through the house like birdsong. Upstairs, James heard it through his office door, that laugh, that impossible, miraculous sound, and he knew in that moment that everything had changed. He couldn't go back to clinical distance. He couldn't keep watching from behind cameras and closed doors. He couldn't keep managing his daughter's death like a business problem to solve. Maria had shown him something he'd forgotten in his grief. Love isn't about control. It's about presence. It's about sitting in the darkness with someone and saying, "You're not alone." James didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if Sophie would live or die. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Maria Santos wasn't just a housekeeper. She was a miracle disguised as an ordinary woman. And somehow, without trying, she had just saved more than Sophie's spirit. She had started to save his too. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The next morning, James woke up with a strange feeling in his chest. Not the usual dread, something else. Something that felt dangerously close to hope. He found Sophie and Maria in the kitchen, both with bald heads catching the morning light. They were making pancakes together, or rather Maria was making them, while Sophie sat at the counter directing operations like a tiny general. "More blueberries," Sophie instructed. Yes, chef, Maria replied with a smile. James stood in the doorway, watching. This was his house, his daughter. But somehow he felt like an outsider looking in on something sacred. Sophie noticed him first. Daddy, look, Maria and I match now. James walked over slowly, his throat tight. He reached out and touched Sophie's head gently, then looked at Maria. Thank you, he said. The words felt inadequate, too small for what she'd done. Maria just nodded. Breakfast is almost ready. For the first time in months, they ate together as something resembling a family. Patricia joined them, her eyes red when she saw Maria's shaved head, understanding immediately what it meant. Sophie ate 4 bites of pancake without being asked. 4 bites was a miracle. But as the days passed, something dark began growing inside James. Something he didn't want to acknowledge but couldn't ignore. Jealousy. He watched Sophie laugh at Maria's jokes. He saw how Sophie reached for Maria's hand when she was scared, not his. He heard Sophie call out for Maria in the middle of the night when she had bad dreams, and each time it felt like a knife twisting deeper. He had tried everything, spent millions on treatments, consulted with the best doctors in the world, rearranged his entire life, and Sophie had only gotten sicker, more withdrawn, more distant from him. Then Maria arrived, and within a week, Sophie was smiling again, eating, talking, living. James told himself he should be grateful. He was grateful. But beneath the gratitude was something uglier, the question that wouldn't stop echoing in his mind. Why her and not me? 2 weeks after the head-shaving incident, Dr. Patel called with news. Sophie's latest blood work showed improvement. Not remission, not a cure, but improvement. Her white blood cell count was stabilizing. The leukemia wasn't progressing as rapidly. I don't have an explanation, Dr. Patel admitted on the phone. But whatever you're doing, don't stop. James should have felt relieved. Instead, he felt something crack inside him. That evening, he called Maria into his study. She stood in front of his desk, hands folded, waiting. I've been reviewing the situation, James began, his voice cold and professional. And I think it's time we made some changes. Maria said nothing, just watched him with those calm, knowing eyes. You've been wonderful with Sophie, truly, but I'm concerned about boundaries. She's becoming too attached. It's not healthy for her to depend so much on someone who's not family. Mr. Harrison, I think it's best if you move on. I'll provide an excellent reference and 2 months severance pay. The silence that followed was deafening. Maria's face didn't change, but something in her eyes dimmed. Is this really about boundaries? She asked quietly. Or is this about something else? James felt his face flush. I don't know what you mean. Yes, you do. Maria's voice was gentle but firm. You're angry that she responds to me, that I can reach her in ways you can't. But Mr. Harrison, that's not about me or you. That's about Sophie needing something different than what she was getting. She doesn't love you less because she loves me. Hearts don't work that way. This isn't a discussion, James said sharply. I need you to pack your things and leave by tomorrow morning. Maria nodded slowly. I understand. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. But before I go, will you let me say goodbye to her? Please. She deserves that much. James hesitated, then nodded curtly. That night, through the cameras, he watched Maria sit with Sophie one last time. She didn't tell her she was leaving. She just held her, sang to her in Spanish, and told her she was brave and strong and loved. When Sophie finally fell asleep, Maria kissed her forehead and whispered, Keep fighting, mi niña, keep fighting. The next morning, Maria was gone. Sophie woke up calling for her. Maria, Maria, where are you? Patricia came to her room, her face tight with barely controlled anger at her son. She had to go, sweetheart. What? No, she can't. She promised she'd stay. Sophie's voice rose, panicked. Daddy, Daddy, where's Maria? James came to her door, and the look on Sophie's face nearly destroyed him. Betrayal, pure, raw betrayal. She had to leave, he said weakly. It was time. You sent her away, Sophie whispered. Then louder, you sent her away. You send everyone away. She turned her face to the wall and wouldn't look at him. For the rest of that day, she refused to eat, refused to take her medicine, refused to speak. By evening, her fever had spiked. By midnight, she was crying in pain. The night nurse called Dr. Patel in a panic. James sat beside Sophie's bed, watching her suffer, and understood with crushing clarity what he had done. He hadn't protected his daughter. He had destroyed the one thing giving her reason to fight. At 3 a.m, Sophie opened her eyes. They were glassy with fever, but focused enough to find his face. I want Maria, she whispered. Please, Daddy, I need her. James's hands shook as he pulled out his phone. He had Maria's number. He'd told himself he deleted it, but he hadn't. His finger hovered over the call button. Pride told him to wait until morning. Fear told him Maria would refuse. But love, real love, the kind that puts someone else's needs above your own pain, told him to call. He pressed the button. Maria answered on the second ring, her voice alert despite the hour. Sophie? She needs you, James said, his voice breaking. I was wrong. Please, come back. There was a pause. Then, I'll be there in 20 minutes. When Maria walked through the door, still wearing her pajamas, Sophie burst into tears of relief. Maria ran to her, climbing into the bed and holding her tight. I'm here, baby, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. Sophie clung to her and, slowly, her breathing calmed. Her fever began to drop. Within an hour, she was asleep in Maria's arms, peaceful for the first time in days. James stood in the doorway, watching them. Patricia appeared beside him, her voice quiet but firm. You almost lost her, not to cancer, to your own pride. James nodded, unable to speak. Over the next weeks, everything changed. James restructured his work, spending half of each day at home. He learned to sit with Sophie without trying to fix things. He watched Maria and learned what presence really meant. And slowly, miracle by miracle, Sophie got stronger. The cancer didn't disappear, but it stopped winning. The treatments started working. Color returned to her cheeks. Laughter returned to the house. 6 months later, Dr. Patel used a word he'd never used before: remission. 1 year later, Sophie's hair had grown back in soft curls. Maria's had too. They still matched, just differently now. On Sophie's 9th birthday, the three of them, James, Sophie, and Maria, stood in the garden where Maria had once cried alone. Sophie ran ahead, chasing butterflies full of life and joy and possibility. Thank you, James said to Maria, for everything, for saving her, for saving me. Maria smiled. I didn't save anyone, I just loved her. That's all any of us can do. Love them while we can. James watched his daughter dance in the sunlight, alive and laughing and here, and he finally understood. The greatest wealth wasn't in his bank account. It was in moments like this, in love that doesn't ask for anything in return, in the courage to be present even when it's painful. Maria had taught him that, and he would spend the rest of his life being grateful, because some miracles come from medicine, but the truest ones come from hearts brave enough to love when there are no guarantees. And that kind of love never dies. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.